Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to our event, Summer of Extremes, How to Change Hearts and Minds in a Changing Climate. I'm Simon Bradshaw and I'm a Research Director at the Climate Council, and I'm going to be facilitating today's live event. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of whichever country you're on. For me, I'm on beautiful Darug country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that this land was never ceded, it always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of First Nations, both here in Australia and around the world, in responding to the climate crisis. And I invite you all to share in the chat the name of the country which you are joining us from today. So today is Giving Tuesday. It's a global event that celebrates organisations making a difference in people's lives. It's also Climate Council's first Giving Day, where we're hoping to raise as much as we can to boost our extreme weather work through the summer. And we're going to be talking to you all about that work. It's an organisation funded by donations from the public. It's your generous contributions that keep us independent, that make our work possible. It's how we keep leaders accountable. It's how we shape the national conversation on the impacts of climate change that are happening now, as well as the policies and solutions that are needed to address it, to protect the people and the places that we love. So before going any further, thank you, all of you, for being part of that incredibly important journey with us and making this work possible at this critical time. And it's a real pleasure to be able to share a bit more about the work we have coming up and what you can be part of supporting. Now, today, when you donate, your impact will be doubled, thanks to our generous donors who have offered to match donations up to $24,000. We're aiming to reach that target in 24 hours, and you can help us reach that by clicking on the link that's now being put in the chat. All right, so I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers. First of all, we have Dr. Martin Rice, who's a Research Director for Strategy Engagement at the Climate Council. Martin has been with the Climate Council since its very inception. He's done a tremendous amount over the years towards the kind of work you're about to hear about, has really been fighting that good fight longer than almost any of us. And it's been a pleasure to work with Martin on that over these last few years. I'll just give you Martin's formal bio. Martin holds a PhD from Macquarie University. His research is focused on integrated Earth system science, research practice, and science communication. He's also an honorary associate, Department of Environmental Sciences at Macquarie University. He's published widely in numerous peer-reviewed journalists, books, and reports. And Martin is a member of the wonderful in-house research team that I'm lucky to be part of as well. So welcome, Martin.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone.
And we have Greg, a modern day hero known to all of you, but I will give Greg's introduction nonetheless. Greg is Greg Mullins, AO, AFSM, is a climate councillor and a founding member of Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, a project that's been supported by the Climate Council. Greg is an internationally recognized expert in responding to major bushfires and natural disasters with more than 50 years experience as a firefighter. He coordinated responses to many major disasters over more than 2 decades, retired as Commissioner of Fire and Rescue New South Wales in January 2017, after nearly 14 years in the role. And on retirement, he immediately rejoined the Rural Fire Brigade, where he started as a volunteer back in 1972 and fought fires throughout New South Wales during the 2019-2020 Black Summer. So please give a warm welcome to Greg.
Thanks, Simon.
Hey, and finally, we're also joined by Climate Council's Head of Strategic Communications, Dinah Arndt. Now, Dinah is a media and communications specialist with extensive experience in growing not-for-profit organizations. She's worked at executive level with boards and committees in the health and environment sectors to create and deliver strategies that make a tangible and lasting difference. Dinah is also someone who's been at Climate Council for a long time, has made an enormous contribution to the work that you've all supported over the years. In particular, Dinah was a former director and indeed a co-founder, of the Climate Media Centre, which I think is one of our most strategically important projects. It trains hundreds of spokespeople a year about how to talk to climate issues and solutions. Dinah also sits on the board of Australian Progress, and an organisation that tasks itself with engaging the public on the big issues facing our future. Welcome, Dinah.
Thank you, Simon, and lovely to join you from Wurundjeri country.
Thank you, Dinah. Okay, well, just to set the scene, 2022, as you've seen, has been a year of unrelenting climate fuel disasters. Now, I've no doubt that many of on the call have sadly been directly affected by the extraordinary ongoing flood situation down our east coast. It's certainly a year where we have really been feeling the consequences of past inaction and seeing the impacts of climate change play out before our lives. Of course, looking beyond our shores, we've seen similar extremes really on every continent. We've all seen what happened in Pakistan, as well as those extraordinary heat waves in Western Europe and in North America. Clearly, none of us are immune from the impacts of climate change, but those impacts are being felt first and hardest by communities, whether here in Australia or around the world, that face particular vulnerabilities and who generally have contributed very little to the problem, yet are being hit first and hardest by its impacts. Now, after a decade in the wilderness, Australia is back with the program when it comes to action on climate change. I've just returned from COP27 in Egypt, where it was clear Australia was working very hard to get itself back in the game to repair some of the reputational damage done over the last few years. We've set a stronger 2030 emissions reduction target, not strong enough, but we have done that and have various policies and initiatives in place to start driving down our emissions this decade. However, it is clear, and we have to be frank, that we still have a long way to go if we are to play our part in avoiding truly catastrophic warming in the future, and if we're really to tap into our potential to play a major positive role here and globally in tackling the climate crisis. Now, Climate Council released a new report this week, authored by Climate Council and Emergency Leaders for Climate Action jointly. Both Martin and Greg had a major part in this extremely important piece of work. You may have seen various stories in the media reporting on its findings. It was a piece we really wanted to get out now ahead of the summer to both sound the alarm on what's coming, but also to ensure that whatever comes is used to catalyze further action on climate change, and that we're doing what we can together to limit future harms. Now, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Martin, my friend and colleague, and one of our wonderful researchers at Climate Council, who is going to give us a presentation on the Great Deluge report. Over to you, Martin.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Just you can see my screen okay? Just want to check that. Yep, okay. So first, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands across Australia. I also recognise them as the cultures as the oldest continuous living cultures on the planet, and that I'm on the Wai-Wurrung people, that are traditional owners of where I am today. Okay, so this slide, this is the UN Secretary General, and as everyone knows, the UN tends to be really quite conservative. But after decades of warnings by the climate science community, the diplomatic gloves are coming off. And I think that this phrase here from the Secretary General is really telling. And it was one made at the opening address to COP27, where, as Simon said, the Climate Council had a strong presence there. So essentially, we're on the highway to climate hell with our foot still in the accelerator. So that's transcended to Australia in many ways and in recent times. As Simon said, this report, The Great Deluge, is actually co-branded, working with the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action that Greg leads, and the Climate Council. It was very much a collaborative effort, bringing together climate scientists, impact scientists, health experts and emergency leaders, and then Dinah and the team working their magic from a comms perspective to make it accessible and punchy. And special thanks, obviously, to donors in the community for making this possible. So the report findings are extremely sobering. I'll run them through them, and they really show how climate change is driving Australia into a new era of unnatural disasters. Oh, excuse me there. Okay, so this one in the report itself, it's just, as Simon said, look, everyone's essentially been impacted by the Great Deluge this year on Eastern Australia and Southeast Australia. So it's been really quite incredible, very unnatural, off the charts. We've seen the floods, the rains, and we've seen the compound events that have happened repeatedly, and sometimes over areas that are still recovering from the Black Summer fires and other extreme weathers. So wettest monthly records were smashed right across from Brisbane to the north, all the way down to Ronina in Tasmania. So no one was spared. So that's it's really important to stress here that climate change was a major factor in the Great Deluge. Well, why is that? So essentially, all extreme events are occurring in a much more supercharged atmosphere because of the burning of coal, oil, and gas. And as the IPCC has said over many years, that heavy rainfall events have led to catastrophic flooding and have been made worse by climate change. So a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture and more energy to fuel storms. So for each 1 degree Celsius rise in global temperature, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. So that basically loads the dice to much more intense rainfall and flooding. So we've seen particular trends, a 10% increase in short duration hourly rainfall across Australia, particularly to the north. In this slide, the picture up to the top right, those in Sydney will not be a stranger to the deluge. And actually, these are called intensity of, well, they're actually called rain bursts, and they happen less than sub-hourly heavy rainfall events, and they've increased by 40% over the past 2 decades in Sydney. We've also seen from the climate science that's available that for every degree warming, future warming could double the frequency of intense rainfall events around the world. So climate change has well and truly loaded the dice and has been a big factor in the Great Deluge. So in the news, you would have also heard about what we call as natural climate drivers and weather patterns. So natural climate drivers, they look at ocean and atmospheric conditions, and they play out in our weather and our climate here in Australia. So we've had a very active set of climate drivers. So La Nina, so on the left panel there, so essentially we get strong trade winds pushing over warmer waters from the East Pacific to the west, and then that has more moisture and then drives more rainfall in particularly the eastern side of Australia, and we've seen that happen repeatedly with the Great Deluge. I guess the sister phenomenon to La Nina is that what happens in the Indian Ocean dipole, and that's in a negative phase. So that's really been loading as well, warm waters, a lot of energy in the system. So we've had the rainfall there too. And then we've also got the southern annular mode, which has been influencing our weather. But I should stress as well that ultimately these natural climate drivers, as important as they are in contributing to the Great Deluge, it's actually the burning of coal, oil and gas and land clearing that's been driving up and accelerating climate change. So all these natural drivers that are occurring in a much warmer climate. So the Bureau of Meteorology in CSIRO last week released the State of the Climate Report 2020. And it said that Australia's climate's warmed by about 1.5 degrees Celsius between 1910 and 2020. And it's irrefutable that that's largely because of the burning of fossil fuels. So let's just have a look at the big hits on Australia. So the economy first. So the costs of extreme weather disasters, and by that we mean floods, bushfires, cyclones, floods, rains, has more than doubled since the 1970s. So we've got a supercharged climate and we've got supercharged impacts on the economy. And that's reached 35 billion for the past decade. I used to live in Brisbane. It's an incredible state, but as former FAR Commissioner for Queensland said in the media yesterday with the launch of a report, the sunny state is well and truly the disaster state. So Queensland's on the front line. It's copped it big time. It's more than any other jurisdiction in Australia, twice as much as New South Wales, as Victoria, and half as much as New South Wales. And alone for the Great Deluge this year, Queensland copped at 7.7 billion in social, financial and economic impacts because of the record-breaking rainfall and floods in February. So more costs, insurance. We released a report earlier this year on just how unaffordable insurance is because of climate change. So the floods in Queensland and New South Wales in particular were the joint costliest extreme weather event ever in Australia. And it cost 5.56 billion in insured losses and over 250,000 claims. Brisbane copped it big time, 1.38 billion in insured losses from the floods. And then further south, Lismore, 500 million. So these are huge impacts for these local government authorities. And then you can see there the hits on Ballina, Byron, Richmond. So very much southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales was greatly impacted by the Great Deluge earlier this year. Farming, agriculture, it's a massive sector for Australia, and they're also on the front line. What I find is equally disturbing and heartbreaking about this, the farmers have gone through bushfires, they've gone through droughts, they were lining up to what would be a considerably bumper harvest this year. And a week or two before, the rains came in New South Wales and Victoria later on this year. Staggering amounts here, estimated 5 billion loss on East Coast grain harvest. So this is a picture here of a farmer assessing the water damage to his crops near Forbes. Obviously Forbes and other places, they were impacted multiple times by floods this year. In Queensland, as I said, on the front line, 17 local government areas, 22,250 primary producers were affected. So that took a 30% hit on the total value production in Queensland. So infrastructure, anyone driving the roads, on the trains, using public transport and active transport, you'll have seen the damage that the Great Deluge has caused on infrastructure. It's really staggering. 1.5 billion estimated cost by the early floods in New South Wales. A stat that came in yesterday in The Guardian, 10,000 kilometres in New South Wales, the damage is estimated to be, and almost 500 million on public infrastructure in Queensland. This is an important point with the Great Deluge and floods badly affected telecommunications. We rely on telecommunications to keep informed during what are becoming increasingly unnatural disasters. So that's of great concern. So who's paying for climate change? Well, we saw, as I said, that the climate is supercharged because of the burning of coal, oil and gas. This infographic that we created for the Great Deluge report shows that actually the fossil fuel companies, many of them, they're making eye-watering profits, but not paying any income tax. And yet when you look at the costs on Australian households, it's staggering. So it's over the past 10 years, it's almost doubled. Per Australian household, the cost has gone up to $1,532. And the costs in local government authorities and elsewhere is huge. So who's paying? for us, the Australian people, and we need to sort out that by ending subsidies on fossil fuels. So just looking ahead quickly for the summer, this satellite image actually came from NASA, and it was taken mid-November. This just shows you the blue, how saturated Eastern Australia is. As we expect for the summer, the danger continues. In fact, it's not just for the summer. I think we need a complete mind adjustment when it comes to unnatural disasters and being prepared. This is it for the long haul. So we need to become much more resilient. So just looking around the country, we could see considerable floods, rainfall events along the east coast because of a supercharged climate, and also the natural climate drivers, La Nina. It's the third one in a row, and it's only happened 2 times before as well. So floods are on the cards. Greg can talk more about this as well, but the AFAC released the bushfire seasonal outlook, and it's quite damning for inland New South Wales for grass fires. And spare a thought for those in WA with extreme heat and the bushfire risk as well. So it's a very dicey summer. That's the seasonal outlook I talked about. And then just for more cheery stuff, so we had Hilary Bambrick, who's our councillor. She's a public health leading authority. So she's been looking at the literature, and it's really quite worrying because of the conducive conditions with an increase in temperature and rainfall in the Great Deluge. Then we've seen mass population growths of mosquitoes, and it's really loading the dice for these debilitating Ross River virus, Burma forest viruses, but also more deadly virus, including the Japanese encephalitis, which has never actually occurred in Australia before. So we're immune to these, and 750,000 Australians could be affected by this. So in a nutshell, the Great Deluge report that we've written with ELCA and the Climate Council really shows that climate change is driving a new area for natural disasters. So this is a wake-up call to all levels of government to be prepared and to actually take much stronger action to deeply reduce their emissions this decade. Thanks, Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for such a clear and comprehensive overview of what we're looking at. We're going to hand to Greg in just a moment. Before we do, just to pick up on one point you had there, I think you've made clear just how enormous the costs being faced by the Australian public are, and also the fact that fossil fuel companies are continuing to rake in very large profits and indeed continuing to be subsidised. And you'll be welcome to know that one of the clear recommendations in our report, everyone, is that we immediately end those remaining fossil fuel subsidies, and that money is redirected into a fund that can be there to support communities with building resilience to climate change and in disaster recovery costs as well. A lot of very confronting and sobering information there. Thank you, Martin. But obviously critically important information for us to understand what we're dealing with, what we're heading into, and how we need to respond to these challenges. Okay, so we're going to go to Greg Mullins now. Now, of course, there's the financial cost, which Martin, you've outlined very clearly, but there's also the costs from these unnatural disasters to lives, to places, to species in ecosystems, to everything we love. And someone who has really dedicated their whole life to protecting all of this is our next panelist, Greg. And Greg, as we heard at the outside, has a long and decorated career, including as New South Wales Fire Commissioner. And in his retirement, he founded Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. He's also written this terrific book, which if you haven't read it yet, I really do recommend. It's packed with so much, personal insight and wisdom into what we're dealing with. And Greg has also rejoined his local rural fire service as a volunteer firefighter. So a quiet retirement, Greg. Can you start by telling us why you and other former emergency service leaders felt it was so important to speak up and to establish Emergency Leaders for Climate Action back in 2019? And why is it so important that that work continues?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Simon. Hi, everybody. Coming to you from Gadigal land. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Look, from 1994, there were major fires in New South Wales in 1994, and they were different. And I won't go into all the details. You'll have to read my fantastic book to find that out. But we had seen as an industry sector, so the emergency services, just worsening disasters. And 1994 was very different because it became dry so quickly. And we now know we had something called a flash drought, which wasn't identified in the literature until about the year 2000, but just suddenly dried out. We had very, very intense fires with a lot of properties lost. 2003, Canberra fires, 488 homes destroyed, 4 lives lost. A firestorm that just tore trees out of the ground by the roots. So an actual firestorm, pyroconvective storm where the fire connected to the stratosphere and brought gale force winds or storm force winds from every direction down to the ground. Very, very rare phenomena. 2009, Black Saturday in Victoria. We had to change the fire danger ratings across Australia after that because we had a scale of 1 to 100, 1 being low fire danger, 100 being extreme. We were regularly going off the scale and having readings up to 200, which happened on Black Saturday. So we brought in a new rating of catastrophic, which just means run away. Don't be there the next day when that weather comes in because even firefighters' lives will be at risk. So a very fast worsening, and it was happening overseas as well. I've studied bushfires in France, Spain, Canada and the US, and colleagues in California, year after year, massive losses, bigger and bigger fires. And then we came to 2018. So 2018, we dodged a bullet. When I say we dodged a bullet, we had fires start in August in New South Wales. We had properties lost on the south coast. We'd never lost homes to fires prior to late November in numbers, but here we were losing fires in the Bega Valley around Ulladulla in August. Queensland burned, Tasmania burned, and in Tasmania, an increasing phenomena, places burned that had never burned before. Ancient Gondwana rainforest, the World Heritage areas, alpine areas, and we still don't know what that's going to do to those species of trees that have never known fire before. And this is an ongoing thing. It rained in New South Wales, and New South Wales was able to supply the rest of the country with firefighters and equipment to assist, and we got through it. But I started talking to former colleagues, retired fire commissioners, deputy commissioners, chiefs, and every single one of them saw what I was seeing. They said, we're in a drought, and if we don't get rain, 2019-20 fire season is going to be something we've never seen before. We don't know what it will look like, but it's going to be really, really bad. So in a nutshell, I formed Emergency Leaders for Climate Action with support from the Climate Council. I couldn't have done it without Climate Council, the administrative support, the organisational support, just how to get things done. We had a number of donors, gave us money so that we were able to do some advertising. And we had a launch. We wrote to the Prime Minister a couple of times, tried to warn of an approaching bushfire catastrophe. And I think everyone knows the story there. We were ignored. Look, the Prime Minister was probably too busy. We didn't know he was Minister for Everything at the time, or soon after, and I shouldn't say that, but it was complete indifference and denial, extremely frustrating, particularly when what we'd predicted happened on steroids. We didn't realise that it would be so bad. So to give you an idea, in New South Wales, 11 times more homes lost than the worst previous year in history, which was 2013. We were losing homes in September. And as I said before, in New South Wales, that never happened until late November through to January. And it just showed. So what was happening is the fire seasons are getting longer. They're overlapping between states and territories, which stops us sharing equipment. Our fire seasons are overlapping with the Northern Hemisphere, which stops us sharing large firefighting aircraft that we leased from Canada and the US. The fires are becoming more intense because it's so much hotter, so much drier. The fires are regularly coupling with the stratosphere, pyroconvective storms, we call them, fire-generated storms. So you get a thunderstorm, a lightning storm without rain, and you have the squalls, the downbursts, and you get new fires starting 30 kilometres away due to lightning. So all of those phenomena and massive impacts on the environment and wildlife, 3 billion animals killed or displaced in the Black Summer fires. So not just, and as Simon explained, it's not just fires. It's heat waves heat waves are the biggest killer in Australia. Heat waves are getting worse, droughts, flooding for every degree of temperature rise, 7% more moisture, major downpours, flash flooding. And what really, I'll say, frightens me at the moment is one of our members, Dr. Chaz Keys, ex-Deputy Director General of New South Wales SES, is a floodplain expert, and he's saying, watch out for February, because historically they're the worst floods in New South Wales and the catchments are saturated. So we had to speak up, and we had a government that didn't want to talk about climate change because they were doing nothing about it. To the contrary, they were making things worse.
Thank you very much, Greg. We're going to have some more questions for you in a moment, but we're just going to hear a little from Dinah first. Before we throw to Dinah, I think speak on behalf of the whole Climate Council community and saying just how much we appreciate your experience and insights and perspectives, and how thankful we are that Emergency Leaders for Climate Action came to be. Now, in some good news, climate concern is at an all-time high in Australia. It's been increasing all the time, but these things don't happen on their own necessarily. It takes the strategic comms expertise of folks like Dinah to really ensure that that happens, and that concern grows and desire for action grows in response to the events that we've seen. Now, one of the things Climate Council does is work with people from a range of backgrounds: farmers, sports people, coal workers, vets, doctors, and organisations like Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, to really amplify the voices of those who have so much skin in the game and who really need to be heard, and who are really trusted when it comes to informing the national conversation about climate change and building support for the policy shifts that need to happen. Now, Dinah, let's hear from you, because I think what we want to know is, could you talk a little bit about Climate Council's narrative strategy, which is all about creating the conditions in which good decisions are made and replicating those at scale? And perhaps you can start by defining what narrative and messaging is and why the messenger is so important. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Greg, for all of your work and the work of Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. So narratives simply are stories. So that's the stories that we tell ourselves and others about how the world works. And a message always sits within a broader narrative or a series of narratives. It's not always the precise words that we use, but rather what we mean by what we say. So what lesson or takeout do we as an audience, take away from what Greg just talked about? We probably, felt his concern, and we felt, his expertise. And if an expert is concerned about a situation, that makes you and I pretty worried as well, I think. So what we saw, going back to the story that Greg shared about that time in the Black Summer, we saw competing narratives and messages playing out in the media at that time. Climate Council, as an organisation since our inception, has been actively and explicitly linking worsening climate impacts, or worsening impacts like bushfires and heat waves, to climate change. And that's really important because during an extreme weather event, people are more receptive to hearing what we have to say. And it's why certain politicians and other bad actors insist that now is not the time. So you'll often hear people say that, and they know that if we miss this window when people are actually paying the most attention, when they're the most receptive, then they're much less likely to notice what's going on at other times. So it makes what Greg was talking about so critical. And then in terms of, I guess, alongside that message piece, just as important as what you say is who says it. The messenger, the person who delivers that message, is really, really important. And again, at Climate Council, we elevate the voices of experts. People do trust experts and they do listen to experts. Sometimes that is climate scientists and wonderful researchers like Martin that you've heard from today. And sometimes it's experts like Greg who have a lot of direct experience as something. So in Greg's case, he's been a firefighter for 50 years. So if you want to hear from someone about how firefighting behaviour is changing, who else would you listen to but someone like Greg, who's been on the front line facing these kinds of situations. So in that lead up to the Black Summer, Greg, our CEO Amanda, other emergency leaders, they were hugely concerned about the upcoming bushfire season. They're also looking at what was being said publicly by the federal government or what wasn't being said. And they also looked at what the media coverage was at the time, and it was actually awful. So not only did they write to the PM directly to try and get an audience, to try and get the government to be actively looking at preparation for the nation, but they also went public. So they sort of bypassed the federal government and went direct to the Australian public to try and warn people about what was in store. And what we actually saw as a result of the public-facing work that emergency leaders and Climate Council and others have done is we saw an incredible shift in the tone and the messages that were coming through media coverage. So if we go back to reporting of Black Saturday, and that was in 2009, 5%, only 5% of all media coverage on bushfires at the time made a link between bushfires and climate change. Compare that to the Black Summer media coverage over the course of that event, and half of all the media made the connection with climate change. So what we've seen over time is a significant improvement in media coverage so that people are getting the information they need to know that this is a major issue. We're also seeing a significant increase in levels of concern. And the way that people generally express that concern is through worsening extremes. So people are understanding much more broadly what it means to actually, what the consequences are of climate inaction. And that's obviously critically important to push governments along and keep them accountable for their actions.
Thank you very much, Dinah, for giving us those insights and for all you do to use your smarts to really drive the conversation in such important ways. Now, if you've just joined us, this is Climate Council's event for Giving Tuesday, where we are raising funds to power this critically important work on extreme weather through the summer. And Climate Council is matching donations up to $24,000. So if you want to do more to help fund this incredibly important work, follow the link in the chat. Greg, we're going to come back to you now. As Dinah mentioned, you and your colleagues played a really important role in shifting the narrative over the 2019-2020 Black Summer fires. And the work of emergency leaders for climate action alone, I've got a stat here, was mentioned across TV, radio, news articles, and social media more than 78,000 times over that period. Why do you, Greg, think that emergency leader for climate action made such an impact in influencing the public narrative at that time and driving decision makers to act faster? And how do you see this role moving forwards in this new political context that we're now in?
Yeah, so I've reflected on this a lot, of course, because we're just us. We were just doing what we do. But firstly, the most trusted people in Australia are firefighters and paramedics. Reader's Digest does a survey every year, and I remember when I was fire commissioner pointing out to my minister at the time that politicians were number 26 and I was number 1 and I should get a pay rise. But no, he didn't agree. But so firefighters are trusted. We, in our careers, had to break some bad news to the community when we had major disasters, but we'd always temper that with what they can do to look after themselves. And so we came from that trusted position. And there was so much misinformation out there about the fires, and it was national parks, overgrown national parks, not enough hazard reduction burning. It was arsonists. The 1851 fires that were not documented, no one remembers because they're all dead, were worse. So there's just all this misinformation. So we called it out directly, and we refuted that, and we kept providing information that people could verify very easily. So I think it's speaking the truth. We weren't bullied into submission by the Murdoch press or their lackeys in Canberra. We weren't scared of them, and part of that was because we're retired. They couldn't affect our remuneration or our jobs, and they would have if we'd spoken out when we were in our jobs, because I'd experienced threats while I was Commissioner of Fire and Rescue. So we told it like it is. And what I saw after that was other groups coming in and telling it like it is from their perspectives in their areas. And that's so vital to have. But we had bushfire survivors coming out. We had farmers coming out talking about the drought impacts, etc., and how it got worse. And a politician who really doesn't have any life experience and only knows how to do the numbers and the factions really can't refute. I'll say it, someone like me who's been fighting fires for 50 years and whose father did it for 60 years. We've seen the changes, so they can go onto Google or whatever, but we called it out and we'll continue to call it out. And we see more and more groups doing that because we face an existential threat if the world doesn't get fair dinkum about emissions, reducing emissions to zero as quickly as we possibly can, because that's what's driving extreme weather, which is killing people in fires, floods, storms and heat waves.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everybody, for your questions in the chat and your enthusiasm. We're going to get to some of those very shortly. Just before we do, back to you, Dinah. Where is the public narrative currently at? Where do we need to get it to? And how is Climate Council working on influencing that at the moment? And also, why is it still so important to have an independent voice, independent of government, like the Climate Council in these times?
Thank you, Simon, for the question. So, I mean, just building on what Greg was saying, like a lot of people do have a lot of things on the line when it comes to public speaking. So whether it's their position, their job, the worry around how their community or organisation or peers might respond. And what we saw under the previous federal government was actually not just the federal government choosing not to talk about climate change, but a federal government that was actively trying to suppress information getting to the public through very trusted institutions like CSIRO and like the Bureau of Meteorology, which is just, deeply concerning. And I think that the importance of organisations like the Climate Council and like Emergency Leaders for Climate Action is we do not operate at the behest of government. We don't receive government funding. We're entirely independent and we're funded by the community. So we only answer to the community. We speak for the community and in the community's interests. And the need for that voice doesn't change with the change in government. While we have gone from an extremely hostile political situation nationally to one where the federal government is now actively making the climate link, and yes, they are doing lots about it, but they're just not accelerating action to the degree that we need to see. And I think that while vast swathes of the population in Australia do understand and appreciate the risks of climate inaction, I think there's still large cohorts of the population that don't appreciate to what extent that those costs might be, and also just how live and immediate the threat is. So I think there's so much that we need to be doing moving forward. I think one, we have to keep talking about the problem. If we just switch entirely and only talk about what all the solutions are, we might end up in a situation where we saw back in 2007 with the former Rudd-Gillard government, where the problem was not talked about enough. And people kind of forgot what all these solutions were actually there to solve and why they were so important to get across the line. We also need to be drawing attention to the real villain, which is the fossil fuel industry. They want to expand their operations. They want to be making higher profits at our expense, and they are adding more fuel to the fire. So we really do need to be drawing everyone's attention to what they're up to. And I think we also need to consider the number one issue for most Australians right now, and that is not climate change. That is cost of living. But we know that so many of the solutions for climate change actually also can address cost of living pressures. So I think we can have some really good and positive outcomes if we can show people more broadly how reducing power bills, reducing the reliance on petrol and all these kinds of things can actually kill two birds with one stone. So our focus as an organisation moving forward around extreme weather is to keep making that direct link, to keep pointing out the problem, which is fossil fuels, that's coal, oil and gas, and to also be drawing people's attention to solutions and the solutions that can address cost of living as well as climate change.
Beautifully summarised. Thank you, Dinah. So I think in short, this work is more important than it's ever been. It absolutely needs a community-funded independent voice that you are all very much part of. Thank you. And if you'd like to make a further donation and have that doubled today to support this next phase of work, then head to the link in the chat. Greg, we have one more question for you before we go to some from the Climate Council community. Just coming right to the present, as we head into this next summer, are Australia's disaster and management planning systems fit for purpose for keeping Australians safe? If not, what needs to be done by governments at all levels in Australia in order to prepare for and respond to climate-fueled disasters? Perhaps also if there's anything else you feel our community needs to hear heading into this summer, especially if obviously feeling anxious about what's ahead, perhaps you could share that too. Over to you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Simon. Look, in short, our emergency management and disaster recovery arrangements were basically drawn up in the 1990s for a far different threat environment. And when I say threat environment, it's very much a military term. For example, in the 1990s, our military, the Australian Defence Force, wouldn't have been looking at China the way they look at it now. There was no Ukrainian war. It's similar in emergency management. Climate change was not as much of a factor. We knew about it, but it wasn't really overtly changing what was happening. Now it has. It's a done deal. It's intensifying floods, fires, every aspect of emergency management. One of the biggest things which the Royal Commission into Black Summer found is that we have compounding events and consecutive events. So I don't know if anyone remembers being a kid going in the surf for the first time. You'd get knocked over by a wave, you'd stand up, knocked over by another one, stand up, unless your big brother or sister was there to pull you out, or mum and dad, you'd just keep getting knocked over. And that's how people are feeling after having massive fires. I was helping clean up around Wiseman's Ferry on the Hawkesbury River some months ago, and the people there, their fourth flood in 18 months, and they just didn't know what to do because they were done. All their insurance payouts had been made. They couldn't afford more insurance, and they certainly didn't have the resources to rebuild, or they didn't know where to go, what to do. So that's the sort of environment we're in due to climate change. Sorry, Simon, can you just, the question again?
It was, what do we need to change at different levels of government to ensure we can be prepared for what's coming?
Yes. So what we need to do, we actually don't know what we're facing because the previous government over 10 years dismantled research capabilities in climate change in the Bureau of Meteorology, in CSIRO, other organisations. So for example, Lismore, they were dealing with flood maps and modelling, I think from 2014, because nothing had been done since then. and then it exceeded the flooding by 2 metres. So we actually don't know what to plan for. So there's a new organisation, Australian Climate Service, was supposed to give information to the states and territories. The Morrison government prohibited them from doing that, and the Albanese government's now changing that. We need a national disaster risk assessment, and from that, a national adaptation and disaster plan. There's a couple of different plans, won't go into all the details, need to be brought together into one, so that then the states and territories which put the emergency services out in the field know what to plan for and aim at. And then we need a massive new recruitment of volunteers and full-time firefighters in the urban fire services who back up the volunteer agencies when fatigue and just sheer workload starts to bring them down. And we need to get people like community first responders. So we saw in Lismore the Tinny Flotilla, spontaneous volunteers, they call them, worldwide. It's a concept. Spontaneous volunteers in major disasters like earthquakes do more rescues than the emergency services. It's always been the way, but let's formalise that, give them the tools. And then we have to work on community resilience, which just means taking a hit and getting back up off the ground afterwards. How do we do that for each community? Community first, fund that. And where do we get the money? That $12 billion almost that every year of our taxpayer money goes to the people who are fueling the warming of our planet, the fossil fuel industry. So now coming into this summer, AFAC, Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council, I used to be board chair and president across Australia, New Zealand. They're saying massive grass fire risk in Western New South Wales, Northern South Australia, Southern Northern Territory and West Australia. That's because with all this rain, there's massive grass growth and it will dry out. And when it dries out, all it needs is a spark and it will go. So we won't get the forest fires that we've had, but we will get heat waves. We will get massive grass fires. So, and also we could get more rain. We could get tropical cyclones, 73% increased chance of tropical cyclones this year. And they often turn into rain depressions and then track south along the east coast. So lots of different hazards. But the big thing we need to do for the future is knuckle down on emissions reduction, because it's the only thing we can do to change the threat environment into the future.
Thank you, Greg. Sure, we're all in absolute furious agreement with all of that. Thank you for sharing all your experience and very practical suggestions as well. Thank you also, Dinah and Martin. Look, we've got about 5 minutes left. We've got a stack of really good questions. I'm sorry we're not going to get through all of them. Let's see if we can smash through as many as we can in the next few minutes. Martin, I think it's time to ask you one. This question is from Rob, who says, to the layperson, global temperature rising by 1.5 degrees may not sound like a big deal. Of course, we all know it is. But how can we put the real story, what's at stake with 1.5 degrees of temperature rise, unequivocally so that everybody can get it?
Well, thanks for the question, Rob. And yeah, I'm glad I got a question. I thought I'd sucked everyone's will to live with my presentation. So look, it's a great question. So when we think about it, the Holocene, 10, 12,000 years ago, we lived in a stable climate. We thrived, farming and so forth. And then the Industrial Revolution came. Our dependence, and there were many advances there, of course, but our dependency on fossil fuels has really accelerated climate change. So with just 1.2 degrees Celsius global warming, we've seen, look, this year, from Lahore to Lismore, there's not one continent that hasn't been deeply affected by climate change. And what we see in climate science, you know, we used to draw these beautiful bell curves, and you'd have the normal and then the extremes. Well, every fraction of a degree matters, because as we get warmer, we push that bell curve off the charts. So that's why we've called the report out on a new era of unnatural disasters. And it's very much not just the science observing through satellites and sea surface temperature monitoring and so forth. it's the lived experience. So look, I was living in Brisbane when the floods came earlier this year. I was also living in northern New South Wales when the Black Summer bushfires came. And just, you know, it's heartbreaking having a look at the webinar chat here and many of our community members who've been deeply affected. So this is just at 1.5 degrees warming in Australia. Our commitments globally and here in Australia are nowhere near what we need to be. So we were compelled, as always, to really make a call for all levels of government to step up their game and deeply reduce their emissions this decade. So that's it in a nutshell. So every fraction of a degree matters.
Thank you, Martin. So one more very quick one for you while you've got the floor. You know, 30 seconds. So we've got time for one for Dinah and Greg. You spent the last month trawling through rainfall data, putting together this crucially important report, understanding the different pieces of what's happened. Was there one thing that really shocked or surprised or encouraged you, or something that you really learned through doing that work?
Well, Greg alluded to this, but it's what we call the compound events that are really worrying, and they came to the front on the report itself. So what that means is, so for example, in the South Coast, communities were deeply affected by the Black Summer fires. And then in January 2020, and then later on, there were major floods. So their temporary accommodation was flooded. We showcased a business and tour operators in the Scenic Rim in Queensland, where they've been actually affected deeply by bushfires, by storms, by the rainfall, the floods. So everyone is affected. And I think it's these compound events, and that leads to Greg's comment about, you know, we're not prepared to what's coming our way. And it's a new set of rules. The rule book's out and we need to act accordingly.
Thanks, Martin. Dinah, quick one for you. This is from Dimity. I know a lot of people who believe in climate change but don't get just how big a deal it is. How do I convey this to them without badgering them?
Great question. And well done, Dimity, for wanting to talk to people about climate change, because I think the two most important things we can do is to be active voters. And the other most important thing we can do is to talk to our family and friends, because one of the most important messengers is us. So to people that are within our social circles and networks, whether it's at work or home or in your community, you are one of the most important messengers. So people really pay attention to what their social circles are talking about. So the first thing you can do is actually to explain why you're concerned. What is it that drives you, and what is it that motivates you to want to take stronger action on climate change? Because someone else might share that motivation and might share that concern. The other thing is to actually inquire about what your audience cares about. So not all of us share the same concerns, and we'll never share the same concerns. But what do they kind of care about? Do they care about cricket? Because you could talk to them about how climate change is impacting on cricket this summer. Are they worried about their cost of living? Because you can talk about how fossil fuels are actually increasing their cost of living and what the solutions might mean to fix the problems they have or that they're deeply worried about. So there's lots of approaches you can take, but I think sometimes it's talking about impacts and concerns. Sometimes it's talking about the opportunity and the solutions, but it always comes down to what people care about.
Such fantastic advice. Thank you, Dinah. Greg, I've reserved one more question for you, because I think it cuts to the heart of the challenge we have as climate communicators and the challenges we have politically at the moment. So we know that we're in a different circumstance from a few years ago. We have a government that's listening to the experts, that is taking progressively stronger action. We also know that we're still approving new gas developments and other fossil fuel developments. So Robin asks, how do you think we can convince the present government that no new gas or coal projects or extensions to existing projects should be approved? How do we convince them that that is incompatible with creating a safe future for Australians?
Great question. In a nutshell, get loud. And it is quite different to the last government, who just stonewalled and were arrogant and unapproachable and quite nasty if you disagreed with them. This is a government that's consulting, listening and doing. But if they're not doing enough, it's our duty to hold them to account. And we have been doing that, Emergency Leaders for Climate Action, Climate Council, in a different way. And it's quite amazing having ideas actually picked up and implemented, whereas before, you know, it was how dare you even talk to us. And I think the community should be reassured that we have a government that understands climate change. So in a way, we don't have to prosecute that argument as much, but we have to remind all the time. But just say this is about our existence and our children and our grandchildren and future generations, and it's not okay. That money needs to go to renewable energy, not to stuff that we know harms us. It's a bit like digging up asbestos and saying, look, firefighters, we'll get you back into asbestos suits because it's cheap and it's good for the economy. Well, no, it'll kill us. So no thanks.
Thank you, Greg. Well, we will get loud. We will do this together. Thank you, everybody, for participating over the last hour. That's all we've got time for. So it's just up to me to offer a couple of words to wrap us up. Obviously, I want to thank each and every one of you for bringing your enthusiasm to this discussion, also for everything you do to support Climate Council. Climate Council is all of us, every one of you. We're all part of this huge project that is much bigger than ourselves. We're all part of this together, and want you to know that, and what an important thing that you are part of. Want to, of course, thank our amazing panel of speakers here, Greg, Martin, and Dinah. That was just so much fantastic insight and information. Thank you. I'll just say it one more time. This work is made possible by every one of you. And we need to match what we do to the enormous scale of the task that is before us. If you'd like to make a donation today, have it doubled by Climate Council and really help power this crucial next window in our work, then head to that link in the chat. Thank you for those of you who've already done that. We're actually very close to meeting our target for today. So thank you to all of you and all the contributions you make to Climate Council. I just also want to recognize and see all those people, many of you I'm sure, who have been very directly affected by extreme weather disasters fueled by climate change over the last many months. Now we see you, we hear you, and we will do everything we can together to limit future harms and to play our part in creating as bright and as safe a future for all of us as possible. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you again. Follow that link in the chat. There's also a post to a little survey if you've got a couple of minutes to give us some feedback. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We'll talk to you again soon, and thank all of you very much.